president of the Historical Society. And could we stand? And the Pledge of Allegiance, the flag is behind you. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We welcome all of you that aren't members, and if you would like to join, we'll take you. And I'm going to turn it over to Kathy Canellis.
Thanks for coming out tonight. We're really happy to have Bob Lettenberger and Bob Leghorn here from the National Railroad Museum. Bob Lettenberger is the Director of Education, and Bob Leghorn is Chief Financial Officer. And I met Bob because another Bob, Bob Hensel, took our family out to the Railroad Museum for the first time and found out that Bob Leghorn has relatives from Brillion. So Bob Lettenberger will give us his presentation, and then Bob Leghorn will talk a little bit about his ancestors. So let's give him a warm welcome.
That was a heck of a build-up. Bob's going to be awesome. Now, we'll review the tape afterwards and see how I did. Pleasure to be with you tonight. And as Kathy mentioned, as we were setting the event up for the evening, we kind of came to realize, and actually Kathy pointed out to us, that the National Railroad Museum has ties to Brillion. And we're going to kind of explore two paths tonight. You notice in our title slide, Mr. Fuller's museum, Harold Fuller, one of our museum founders, definitely ties to this community. But then as Bob and I have been kicking around over the last couple of weeks and getting ready, Harold is kind of the past tie to the museum. And we like to think of Bob Leghorn here as our contemporary tie to Brillion and with the National Railroad Museum. And one other thing that we kind of came across as we were getting ready for this evening, Kathy actually sent us a photograph of which I'm going to just show you a small portion up there. Some of you may recognize Harold Fuller, and as we'll discuss a little bit later, one of the founders of our museum. But what we're going to do for a moment, we're going to step back from the past. We're going to do the contemporary here first. And with that, I present you with an image that maybe some of you are familiar with, 226 Cleveland Street, right here in Brillion. And to put this all in context, we're going to have Bob Leghorn explain his ties to Brillion, and then we'll move on with the past. So Bob, if you would.
Thank you. Well, like Bob said, my name is Bob Leghorn, and my parents on both sides came from Brillion, and a few generations before that also. So what I'm going to talk about today is a brief history of my grandparents and their children and their lives in Brillion. I'm just going to talk for a few minutes about that, and then Bob will take over talking about Harold Fuller and the National Railroad Museum. Well, to start with, my parents on my mother's side were Michael Kleiber and Mary Wines, and they were married, let's see, June 13th, 1911 at Hilbert, but they both were living in Brillion at the time. And they had 4 children, 2 of whom did not live past infancy. That was Ralph and Esther Kleiber. And their first child that I guess you could say made it was my mother, Gertrude Kleiber. So, and my grandmother, Mary Wines Kleiber, kept a kind of a journal of the raising of Gertrude being her first child that survived. And we got that at our house, and I'd like to read you a few passages from the journal that Mary Weiss kept. And we'll start with, I'll pass this around. This is a photograph of my grandparents' wedding in 1911. That's my grandfather right there, Michael Kleiber, his wife Mary, and the other people are Paul Kleiber and maybe Nellis, I believe. And over here, Michael Kleiber and Mary Wines Kleiber. And this little story about their wedding will give you more information about all of them. So I'll pass this around. You can have a closer look at it. It says who's who on the back, too. So this was an article from 1911 called A Double Wedding from, I believe it's from a newspaper in Hilbert. It said a double wedding took place at the Catholic Church today. Mrs. Wines, more than one miss, become brides of prominent young men. An unusually pretty double wedding was that of Miss Mary Wines and Michael Kleiber, and Miss Louisa Wines and Anton Pritzel at St. Mary's Catholic Church in Hilbert at 9:30 o'clock Tuesday morning. Miss Mary Wines and Michael Kleiber Brillion were attended by Mrs. Elizabeth Kleiber Brillion. They're all on that picture. Elizabeth Kleiber is the niece of the groom, and Margaret Niles of here. Paul Kleiber Brillion, brother of the groom, and John Wines of Brillion, cousin of the bride. The bridal parties were to get to and from church in automobiles. Imagine that. And they were accompanied by the Brillion Orchestra, who played a lively wedding march both ways. An elegant wedding dinner was served at the homes of the bride's parents to several hundred guests. All tripped the light fantastic to the music of the Brillion Orchestra until long past the wee small hours of the morning. A delightful time was the report of those present. So, a little graphic journalism from 1911. Okay. Then my mother Gertrude was born January 2nd, 1919. And as I said, my grandmother kept a journal of Gertrude's life, a lot more detailed at first, as I'm sure a lot of you parents would know. And then as the years went by, there was less and less things that happened in her life. But I copied some of the more unusual and interesting items from that journal. And I'll read you 3 passages from here. The first one, August 22nd, 1925. Mother and Daddy went on 2 weeks tour to Yellowstone National Park, and Gertrude stayed with Ma Wines and Aunt Louise and Uncle Tony's house during that time. She received a card or letter from Mother every day. Mother brought her a baby doll and a Yellowstone silver bear ring along, and Gertrude was as happy as her parents when they came home from their vacation. After her parents returned from Yellowstone Park, Gertrude started her second school year, being in the 2nd grade. So imagine going to Yellowstone Park. They went by the railroad, by C&W Railroad, at least to start. I don't know what connections they made, and they got out to Yellowstone in 1925. So, and they have a lot more about what they did in Yellowstone in her diary there also. Now the next entry is from April 18th, 1929. There's a little picture with this one. I'll kind of hold this up, it's hard to see. There's my mother Gertrude, her sister Joan, and Grandma Kleiber right there. My grandfather's mother. It says, this picture was taken April 13th, 1929, and the next day Gertrude was taken sick with scarlet fever. She was not well on the day it was taken. She stayed home from school and had been sick for 4 days before the rash showed, and we called Dr. Boyd. He said scarlet fever, and we were quarantined for 3 weeks. Daddy made his home in the shop. Grandma Kleiber had been visiting us the week before and just took her home the evening before we were quarantined. But Gertrude had a light touch of fever and rash and was a very good girl in her sickness, not a bit discouraged. So, how different from today. And the last real short passage is from 1934. Gertrude attended her first dance at the age of 15 at the junior prom. Her escort was Hugo Bladorn, a junior. She wore a formal gown of pale blue crepe silk and white slippers. So, and her, the person who went to the dance with her, well, she was 15, and eventually they became married, and those are my parents. So let's see. Oh, I've got one more short reading. A few years later, in 1943, my grandfather, Mike Kleiber, passed away, and this is part of his obituary. Mike Kleiber is summoned by death. Again, the summons has come calling for one of our well-known citizens to his final reward. Michael Kleiber died early Tuesday morning at St. Vincent's Hospital in Green Bay of a heart ailment. It was our privilege to have known Mike, as he was called by his friends, many years. Never have we heard him spoken of in other than terms of respect and liking. We attribute this chiefly to his unfailing decency. In his personal and business relationships, he was always honest and decent, and all who knew him will remember him for that. The bereaved widow and family have the sympathy of the entire community. Michael Kleiber was born on May 26, 1885, son of the late Mr. and Mrs. John Kleiber, town of Maple Grove. Attaining manhood's estate, he was married in 1911 to Miss Mary Wines of Hilbert. The following year, the young couple took up their residence in our city, in Brillion, that is, where the decedent has been successfully engaged in the farm implement business. But he was also community-minded and took an active interest in everything pertaining to the welfare of Brillion. When the Lions Club was organized, he became one of its most popular members, and tasks assigned to him were cheerfully assumed. He was also a member of St. Mary's Congregation, Catholic, the Holy Name Society, and the Catholic Knights. So, that's a bit about my mother's side. And now we'll take a quick view of my father's side, the Bladorns. So, I'll flip over to this other chart. My father did these charts in the 1980s. They've been rolled up in the closet for many years, so I'm finally getting use of some of my English books. Okay. Well, anyway, my father's parents were Fred Bladorn Sr., born in 1872 at Casson, Wisconsin. Oh, very good. And he died April 4th, 1936. He's buried in the Lutheran Cemetery in Brillion. So, and that'll play a part in what we're just going to talk about in a minute. His first wife was Blanche Moyer. My father couldn't ascertain when she was born, but she died in 1908 and was buried at the Brothertown Cemetery. Okay, and my grandfather, Fred Bladorn, worked as a butcher and also at the Brillion lime kilns. So with his first wife, Blanche Moyer, who died in 1908, they had 6 children. The first, Beatrice, the second, Gordon, the third, Catherine, the fourth, Arnold Bladorn, then Eben, and finally Lester, who died at age 3. He's buried in the Lutheran Cemetery in Brillion. And of course, as you might know, I guess the Historical Society had a recent article about the VFW in Brillion being named for Arnold Bladorn. And he served in World War I, one of the first Brillion residents. He might have passed away in the war, I'm not sure. But we have a record that he died in 1918. And so Fred's second wife, after the death of Blanche Moyer, was Anna Jux. And this is my grandmother. She was born in 1876 in Germany. She died in 1955 and is buried in the Lutheran Cemetery in Brillion, Wisconsin. And her children were Ruth, Fred Jr. Fred Jr. is right here, and some of you may know him. I know some of you do indeed remember Fred. He was a butcher. He had a butcher shop on Main Street, right somewhere near the library here. Joanna, she was married to Clarence Wolf, the longtime mayor of Brillion. And Elvira, her son is got the last generation that's carrying on the Brillion name. And finally, the youngest was my father, Hugo, who was born 1917, December 8th in Brillion, and he lived until 1987. Finally, this picture, pass this one around too, is my parents' wedding photo. My father served in World War II in the South Pacific, mainly in Papua New Guinea, also some time in the Philippines, that's in uniform. And my mother married Gertrude Clyber Bladorn. And there's my father's brother, Fred Bladorn Jr., and my mother's sister, Joan Clyber. So you can have a look at that. That's from their wedding in 1945. Now, and also in that wedding, my father, Hugo, he was a Lutheran, and my mother, Gertrude, she was Catholic. So at that time, of course, that caused a little trouble, but they were still married, and eventually my father converted to Catholicism. He worked for after the war, he got a job working for the Chicago Northwestern Railroad, and working for the railroad, he traveled around quite a bit, and that's when our families left Brillion. He got a job first near Beaver Dam, and then moved on to the what they call the power desk in Chicago, where they did a lot of the train dispatching for the entire unit, and then he settled eventually in Green Bay, where I was born in 1957. And they had 3 children, my brother Mike, born in 1946, Fred in 1951, and myself in 1957. And in the meantime, of course, my grandmother, Mary Clyber, she was the only grandmother or father that was living since the time I've been alive. So she continued to live in Brillion. That's her house right there that she lived in. And that'll bring us up to the present. I've been working at the National Railroad Museum since about 1996. And this last summer, as is our responsibility, we take turns on weekends being the manager on duty. And oftentimes we have to conduct or engineer the train ride. And well, on one ride last summer, I was giving my little talk as a conductor, and I mentioned that, as I always do, that my grandparents lived in Brillion, and the hobos would pass through town during the Depression, and they put a mark on one of the outbuildings, probably the garage behind that building. They drew a little bird on it that meant that they could get a free meal there, the hobos. But my grandmother never allowed them to come into the house, of course. They had to eat it on the porch. So I told that story as I always did, not knowing that Kathy was riding on the train. And afterwards, she introduced herself and we got to talking. And well, that's our connection brings me back to Brillion here. I'm glad to be here, and I'll turn it back over to Bob now. He'll tell you a little bit more about the railroad.
All right. That 6 degrees of separation seems to have shrunk considerably. So, all right. Bob went a little further back in history than I thought he was going to, which is very good. So we'll go back into now museum history a bit, and we're going to kind of pick things up in the 1950s, if you will. There's the photograph that I showed you at the beginning, and you see Mr. Fuller standing right there in the middle, and the rest of the crew that was with him, that photo where I had just cropped him out. Does anybody recognize any folks here? A few? Yeah? Okay. Well, we'll flip over and show you the back as well. There's a small caption on the bottom of the front side of this photo that says the Brillion Express. And knowing Harold Fuller, I'm going to imagine that the Brillion Express was probably a gathering at the museum early on. We're going to say probably the early part of the 60s. And in one of the museum's cars, the particular car you see here is actually a combine coach, and a very fancy one dating to the 1800s. But more so for our discussion, if you look at the caption from the back here, we see Fuller here named. I believe you have a car dealership in town here by the name of Horn. All right. Oliver Wendell? Wardell, okay. We have one gentleman, looks like right here, that is a choice between two different folks, either a Xander or a Pagel.
It's Clarence Poggle, and he was my uncle.
Okay, there we go. All right. Let's see, Mr. Ambrosius, Mr. Koch, Peters, and a Dr. Goltz down here in the corner. And by the nods in the room, I'm going to guess that most of the folks are from Brillion, and you could probably fill in quite a bit more history about them. But the thing I want to mention with this particular image, before we move on, is this: Harold Fuller was a great showman, and a lot of what we have at the museum today, well, we really owe to Harold from the standpoint of, and it's something that I always get in trouble for, you don't know until you ask, all right? Harold was the guy who went and asked. And as our story unfolds tonight, you're going to see how many people Harold knew, or more so translated, how many people he was not afraid to go and ask for something from, all right? And from what we know, I'm going to imagine that the scene here is not only one of bringing the folks from Brillion up to the new and burgeoning museum to see what's going on. There might have been a little twisting, small asks for this or that, but there's also going to be a huge presence of Mr. Fuller's pride. What he accomplished really from nothing to where the National Railroad Museum is today is quite a huge step. And if he had not made some of the initial moves that he did, I know we wouldn't be where we are today. Harold Fuller was with us right from the very beginning. This is the first page of our Articles of Incorporation, dating to 1956. And if you notice right in the middle here, our registered agent was none other than Mr. Fuller. And interestingly enough, when you look at the first board of directors, Harold's name is not listed amongst that group. He did not come onto the board until a little later. But again, with that idea of what can we go and ask for, Harold did come up with a few big people to have on our original board of directors. You see one down here, Dr. Clifford Lord. He was the director of the Wisconsin State Historical Society at the time. We see over here A.C. Kalmbach. Kalmbach Publishing still exists in Waukesha today. They are probably one of the leading hobby publishing companies for the trains and railroad field. And he was brought in here. One other one I wanted to point out. Yep, Mr. Banta from Banta Publishing. And also here, H. Weldon McGee, who was president of the Green Bay and Western Railroad at the time. So to start off this idea of a National Railroad Museum, there was quite a bit of firepower behind us to begin with. Picture of the early museum And if you compare that with a shot from today, wow, radically different. The thing I want to mention here, the museum started off not as a museum. The first goal for Mr. Fuller and his associates was really to get a steam locomotive and preserve it in a city park. It's the middle of the 50s. The railroads are switching from steam power over to diesel power, and steam locomotives are being scrapped like they're a dime a dozen. And a lot of towns are trying to preserve a locomotive, put it in a city park to remind us of past times. That was the initial goal that Mr. Fuller was involved with, and it sprouted into the National Railroad Museum. The view you see here, this is Cook Memorial Park, where we still exist today. This is Dutchman's Creek, this is the Fox River, and the part of the park that you see right here actually is the part that belongs to the city of Green Bay. The National Railroad Museum has a lease on it in perpetuity for $1 a year, as long as we maintain the railroad museum there. The section you see on the other side of Dutchman's Creek is actually a Brown County park. We have the same arrangement there. So here's the first, let's call it Harold Fullerism about the museum. When he approached the city of Green Bay and said, we want to put a locomotive in a park, at first they were looking at Seymour Park in a different part of Green Bay. And our location actually is in the village of Ashwaubenon. When they began looking at Cook Park, the city had just received the land from the Cooks, or actually it had been in the city's portfolio for a couple of decades, but they had not done anything with it. So they were just at the point of, what can we do with this land? Well, along come this group of gentlemen that say, we want to put a locomotive there. Okay. At the same time that that was going on, the Parks Commission had begun to develop some plans of their own. One was that they were beginning to feel some pressure to put a boat dock and a boat landing down here along the river. So, Mr. Fuller and group come in and say, tell you what, how about out of this 23-acre parcel, why don't you give us 10 right up here by the road? We'll put our locomotive there. That's what we want to do. Agreed to, fine, great. Go get your locomotive, you now have a place to put it. By 1963, and this is a little bit after they had actually acquired that first locomotive, a fence and a gate gets erected across the front of the property here. And of course, there is quite a hullabaloo about this. And Mr. Fuller is in the center of it. And the question is, why have you done this? This was not necessarily agreed to. You're blocking off development from the rest of the community. And so instead of saying, oh, we're sorry, we just want to protect our assets, no. Mr. Fuller and group turn around and say, tell you what, we already got a fence up, we got 10 acres, why don't you give us the rest of it to use right away too? Now you know how we got our 23 acres on the north side of Dutchman's Creek, right? Of course, that first locomotive, this whole idea of putting a locomotive in the park actually started back in about 1955. And the first few tries at garnering a locomotive were very unsuccessful. Mr. Fuller, amongst the group that was initially working with him, there's one name that was not on that initial board of directors, which kind of surprises all of us, was that of Frederick J. Lenfesty. And if you look at Fuller and Lenfesty, Fuller was the ask man, and Lenfesty was the money that came along and made the projects happen, or in some cases, cleaned up a few of the problems that had arisen. And Harold had been out looking for a locomotive and was having difficulty, been rebuffed by a number of the railroads. Len Feste and Fuller made a trip over to Wausau to see D.C. Everest, who was president of Marathon Paper. And they explained what the plight was, and Everest thought, you know, this is a pretty good idea. I like what these guys are saying. And he looked out the window, and there outside of his office, switching the Marathon Paper plant, was a Milwaukee Road engine. Milwaukee Road served Marathon Paper. And Harold Fuller said to Mr. Everest, don't bother, they've already turned us down. No. D.C. Everest picked up the phone on behalf of this steam preservation committee in Green Bay and leaned on the Milwaukee Road and said, you know what, you need to find these guys a locomotive. Because if you don't, that switch engine from the Milwaukee Road on one side of my paper mill can just as easily be one from the Chicago Northwestern on the other side of my paper mill. So the first locomotive that the museum acquired was Milwaukee Road number 261. You see it here. And one of the things with the early museum, and I think a lot of this does come from Harold Fuller, was that there was a great deal of that showmanship. Great big locomotive. Look at this young man right here. He has just met his dream. He has just seen his fancy. This was one of the early publicity pictures for what would become the National Railroad Museum. Of course, there is Mr. Fuller with his prize catch, the 261. It took a number of years from when they acquired it until when it actually made it onto the museum grounds. And it was not until a rather snowy day in 1958 that the 261 was delivered to what would become the National Railroad Museum. Now, a little word about National Railroad Museum. While this drive to preserve a locomotive in the park is going on, there's another movement that is working as an undercurrent here. You remember back, one of the initial directors was a gentleman named Clifford Lord. He was director of the Wisconsin State Historical Society. Very well connected, as you would suspect. And one of the gentlemen that Mr. Lord knew was a man named Carl Gray Jr. All right, General Gray was in charge of the military rail service during World War II. The Gray family also was in the upper management of the Union Pacific Railroad. Harold Fuller served eventually, or way down the ladder, under Gray during World War II. Gray at the time believed that there should be a National Railroad Museum. There should be some place in our country to preserve this industry that really has helped build our nation, is woven into the fabric of our country. Gray and Lord got together, and this idea is communicated. Lord turns around and communicates that idea to the Steam Preservation Committee in Green Bay that's looking to save this one locomotive. And from that conversation, and really, when you think about it, with the chutzpah and fortitude and enthusiasm of Harold Fuller, the effort goes from a locomotive in the park to a National Railroad Museum. All right? There was a plan early on that the National Railroad Museum would actually be operated and be part of the Wisconsin State Historical Society. The two groups didn't see eye to eye and eventually parted ways. In fact, in talking about the early part of the National Railroad Museum, here's one of the big problems that we do have. The idea of proper museum practices weren't necessarily adhered to. It was more so an enthusiasm for trains and for preserving pieces of equipment that could be garnered. Very honestly, the record keeping was not what it should have been. In fact, a lot of the early records for the museum, and this is something that I've been told from people a couple of years well before me, a lot of the early records for the museum, before we had facilities on the grounds, were actually kept in Harold Fuller's basement. Unfortunately, Mr. Fuller passes away, and the family looks and says, what do we do with all this file cabinets of Dad's stuff? All right. Yeah, it would have been great to have had those and kind of fill in some of the story, but unfortunately they were junk in the basement, if you will, and went by the boards. Harold did not stop with getting just a few pieces of equipment. In fact, our rolling stock collection today is a little over 65 pieces, and we have had actually more than that over the years. But the interesting thing about Harold Fuller and what he asked for was that the magnitude kept increasing as time went along. And when we got to the early part of the 1960s, 61, 62, steam is definitely out on American railroads. And when you look to the west, there was a lot of very large locomotives that were being scrapped on a daily basis. And one of those, you see here, the Union Pacific Big Boy, one of the world's largest steam locomotives. 132 feet 9 7/8 inches long, weighs in at 1.18 million pounds. Wow, what if we had one of those in Green Bay to go along with the rest of the collection? Guess who makes a trip out to Omaha, Nebraska? Walks into the office of Arthur Stoddard, president of the Union Pacific Railroad, by the way, an old war buddy of Harold Fuller's, and says, Mr. Stoddard, how about a big boy for Green Bay? Hey, you don't know until you ask, right? You don't know until you ask. Out of 25 big boys that were produced, there's 8 left, and there's number 4017 on its way to Green Bay. In fact, it was a big deal, especially for Harold Fuller, who, guess what? You see right here in the cab as the locomotive is making its final leg through Green Bay to the National Railroad Museum. And of course, the ever-conscious publicity man made sure that there was a sign to let everybody know exactly where this big horse was going. And today, that locomotive is one of the centerpieces of our collection. Now, you think about that and you say, okay, Harold Fuller has really kind of reached an apex of asking size-wise, yes? Well, he kind of had one more stunt, if you will, but this was more from a magnitude standpoint. The big boy, when it first got to the National Railroad Museum, and this is the mid-60s. A lot different today. The space where the big boy sits now, or is sitting there in that picture, is actually where our Lenfesty Center is today, our 26,000 square foot exhibit facility. Before we get into Harold's final big ask, from the Santa Fe, we received number 5017, a big Texas class locomotive, just a little smaller than the big boy. But here again, here's the publicity photo with the gentleman from the handing over the locomotive, museum president at the time. Who's in the picture? There you go. Another one of his babies has come home to the museum. Museum gets to the early part of the 1970s. And attendance at this point is in the 20 to 30,000 range on an annual basis. And the board of directors realizes that, you know what, if we're going to preserve some of these pieces, we need to get them under cover. The Wisconsin winter is getting a bit harsh on these. And you notice by this time we now have a depot out here toward the front of the property. And you see under construction right here the Victor McCormick Train Pavilion. Still stands today. It's an open air facility that keeps the rain and the snow off of pieces. The building cost a little over $22,000 at the time. We're thinking about building a new building right now. By God, I wish it would cost $22,000 only. I think Bob does too. He's probably got to write the check for this at some point. I think one office may cost $22,000 today. And trust me, it's not going to be my office. Here's one of these great Harold Fuller stories. $22,000. The museum had raised $15,000. Most of that came from Victor McCormick. The story has it that Harold Fuller approached Mr. McCormick about making a sizable donation, worthy of having his name on the building. And at first, Mr. McCormick said, no, I don't think you guys are far enough along. I'm not ready to contribute. I don't know how many visits later, but the story eventually is that McCormick looked at Fuller on a subsequent meeting and said, how much do you want? I'm going to give it to you so you stop bugging me and get out of my office. That left the museum $5,000 short. Well, geez, what are we going to do? Harold Fuller makes another trip out to Omaha, and this time, instead of seeing Arthur Stoddard, looks to one of the other great families within the Union Pacific tree, and that's the Harriman family. And by this time, Roland Harriman was well placed within the Union Pacific company structure. Edward Harriman, Roland's father, actually is the one that back in the early part of the 1900s brought the Union Pacific out of receivership and put them on a firm financial footing. So the Harriman family was, one, well off themselves, but also very well placed within the Union Pacific. And here's Harold Fuller knocking on the door going, can you help us with our new building? Oh, $5,000 short. He got his $5,000, we got our Victor McCormick train pavilion. Mr. Fuller's probably one of his biggest and most arduous accomplishments, and this goes to the magnitude, not necessarily the size, because flippantly I can say the locomotive you're looking at weighs only 125 tons, all right? Dwight D. Eisenhower, the locomotive. Anybody heard of this machine of late? Okay. Went over to England a couple of years ago to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the establishment of the world speed record for steaming, which was set by another A4 class locomotive, which is what Dwight is. If we go back to about 1957, 58, there's a man at the museum weeding one of the flower beds up along the front fence line. And a lady who was kind of looking on to the grounds at that point, curious about what was going on, looked down at this gentleman pulling weeds and said, you know, there's a locomotive in England. I know it's there because I've seen it, and it's named Dwight D. Eisenhower, after our president and general, actually named after Dwight as a general for his work during World War II. You know, it would be really neat if that locomotive were here in America. It celebrates us in American railroading. Little did she know that that man down on his knees weeding the flower bed was Harold Fuller. This was kind of like, this lady's comment was kind of like laying out the breadcrumbs, you know, for the little bird to come along and see how far we could go. It was the bulldog took hold of the bone and didn't let go until that locomotive resided in the National Railroad Museum's collection. Harold took up the gauntlet. He took up the challenge. The Eisenhower locomotive was going to come to the National Railroad Museum. And it started off with a very simple call to the British Railway Board, who promptly told Mr. Fuller, no, I'm sorry, Dwight has many good years of service left. You can't have her. Okay. A lot of folks probably would have given up at that. International rebuff. No, not Harold Fuller. Once again, we head back to Omaha. Harold calls on his friends in the Union Pacific who know not only what is going on in Green Bay, but also happen to know some folks over in England on the British Railway Board. And Fuller is introduced to a gentleman named Shar Carrington, who is in a position to help the process along. There was a few more years of dogged negotiation, but from a man pulling flowers to a man standing next to Lee Bryce, U.S. Ambassador in London, England, while Prince Philip hands over a golden key giving the Eisenhower locomotive to the United States and the National Railroad Museum. It was a bit of a journey, but Harold stuck with it until he got there. And today, the white, one of 6 A4s that are left, is one of those locomotives that's a real calling card for us. And it not only has international acclaim, but when you look at it in our collection, it also very much speaks to our history, but we also use it to talk about science and math and art and so many other things in that one simple locomotive, which one man from pulling flowers decided to bring into the National Railroad Museum. The locomotive being loaded on the SS Planter at Southampton for its trip across the ocean. Now, the museum, by the time we got into the middle part of the 70s, was quite honestly starting to run out of money and also a bit of steam. People like Fuller and a lot of those other original directors were getting old, folks. They were ready to retire from retirement. They had given this their all and they wanted to take a rest. And yet the museum was having difficulties. There was some serious debt that needed to be surmounted. And Harold Fuller, Ted Lenfesky, pulled out one more big rabbit out of the hat. When I got to the museum, there was a gentleman there named Warren Mott. Anybody heard that name? Yeah. Everybody from the museum knows who Warren Mott is. Warren was also with the Chicago Northwestern, common theme here, see where we are? Warren was train master in Green Bay and took a great interest in the National Railroad Museum. One, because a lot of the equipment, well, all of the equipment that came to the museum came in on the Chicago Northwestern, but Warren also just liked trains. And one of Warren's favorite stories to tell was about this rabbit that Harold Fuller pulled out of the hat that got the museum off the brink of, well, I don't want to say almost bankruptcy, but some serious financial troubles. And that rabbit came about in 1975. There was a train crossing the country called the American Freedom Train in celebration of the American Bicentennial. You see it here. The train carried along a number of cars that had some very interesting artifacts on. And as it traveled across the country, it would pull into a town, tickets would be sold, and you got to go through basically this museum on the rails. The train was scheduled to go from Chicago to Madison and then on out to the west. How about a detour to Green Bay? Yeah. Harold Fuller and Ted Lenfesky talked the managers of the Freedom Train into altering the schedule and bringing the Freedom Train up to Green Bay and parking it at the National Railroad Museum. And that happened in 1975, the weekend of August 16th and 17th. And while it was there, over 50,000 people toured the train. Yes, ma'am.
I toured.
You were one of those. I got Sandy's ticket here. You were one of them, yeah. You did? Okay, there we go. Two of the over 50,000 that were there. What was admission?
It was like 50 cents. We
Oh,
just moved to Wisconsin.
I have no idea.
Okay.
We just moved to Wisconsin and we had 4 children.
Okay.
And I think it was 50 cents for the children and $1 for the adults.
There we go. Your contribution helped the National Railroad Museum get over a hump of some pretty tough times. That was about Harold Fuller's last gasp with the National Railroad Museum. He passed away in 1978. The legacy that he left, the decade of the 80s was still rather dark for the museum. In fact, the Green Bay Convention and Visitors Bureau actually operated the museum through the first part of the 1980s. It was about 89, 90 when the museum board took over the museum again and set us on the path of actually becoming a professional standard complying museum that we're moving toward today. Now, there is, of course, one last little fun thing here about Mr. Fuller. There's a little locomotive, number 29, that for a great number of years was named the Brillion Pioneer. You see it here. It actually was the shop goat for the Pullman Company down in Pullman, Illinois, outside of Chicago. It moved the being assembled Pullman cars around the facility there. It was acquired by Mr. Fuller, donated to the museum. It actually ran under live steam for a number of years while we still did live steam at the museum. You see it here actually close to our station. In the background there, that is the Super Value or Red Owl warehouse at the time. Much nicer picture of that little locomotive going across one of our train bridges. In fact, interestingly enough, this particular image is a postcard that was sold at the museum at the time. Probably went for all of a nickel or so. Today, if you want this, $8.45 out on eBay. So, and you see that label right on the side there for the Brillion Pioneer. So,
That was the name of the book that he wrote.
yes.
And his father wrote,
Oh, his
his
father?
father was Elmer Fuller, yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Elmer Fuller was deceased by 1928. That was Harold's father.
He's our historian.
All right. Can I have somebody sit
I've got
there?
history on Elmer Fuller that I've talked about.
Yeah.
It was in our, I think, November newsletter, October-November newsletter. Our main newsletter will have an article about Harold's sons, Dudley and Harold Elmer Fuller that you're hearing about here.
So, all right. So from our very start, the very beginning of the National Railroad Museum, when probably there was gentlemen sitting around having a cup of coffee somewhere saying, let's put a locomotive in the park, to our collection today, to even our staff today, we've got ties to the little town of Brillion. And what's very neat about this, when you think about it, small town America is, I mean, it's our grassroots. And when you think that somebody like Mr. Fuller, or even Bob here, keeping us on the financial straight and narrow today, finds their roots in a small town and has been projected onto what is the national stage. And when you look at where the museum is now and where we are going, that stage becomes brighter and brighter every day. The time period we're talking here, museum attendance, if they hit 40,000 a year, they were very lucky. Last year we took about a 10 to 13% increase in attendance, and we're very close to 86,000. Yeah, the Packers put that many in the stadium for a game, but 86,000 for us for a year is pretty fantastic. And when you look at from the very beginning, one of the images or visions that Harold Fuller and the rest of that crew had to start with was a big exhibit facility with a turntable and a roundhouse. Want to guess what our new building's going to look like? Yeah, so an amazing, amazing 60 years worth of history. By the way, it is our 60th anniversary this year at the National Railroad Museum. How about questions before we end up? Anything? All right, very good. Well, yes, sir.
When are you gonna get that steam engine out,
Which one?
the climax?
Actually ours is not a climax. We have a shay. All right, we've never had a climax at the museum. Steam locomotives come in 4 varieties. Pistons on the side, straight reciprocating locomotive. For mining and logging conditions, there was a locomotive invented called a shay, in which the pistons are vertical and go to the wheels on a drive shaft. There is a climax where the pistons are at a 45-degree angle and also connect to the wheels through gears. And then there is what's called a Heisler, which has the cylinders in a V underneath and have a drive shaft. We in our collection have a shay. What you're thinking of is probably the Heisler that we used to have. That was on loan to us from a group down in, just north of Milwaukee. That locomotive has been returned to that group, and they have moved it out to, I believe, Nevada. So, we do not have a Heisler anymore. Our shay, it'll figure in the new building, and really what we'd like to do with it is build a forest in the building and put it in there and show how it was really used, but that's a few years down the road. So, anything else? It's been a pleasure being with you tonight, folks. Stop up and see us sometime soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing the story. I'm sure we can all connect to it. And we have a little lunch in the back of the room. You're invited to stay if you'd like. And thank you all for coming.